the alley that wasn't there. The night began the way most Friday nights did for Martin. Too many pints, too much laughter, and too little memory of what pub came after the last. His mates had decided on a crawl across the city center, moving from one neon-lit doorway to the next. Somewhere between the third and fourth bar, Martin had drifted behind, his vision blurred with ale and cigarette smoke. The crowd swallowed his friends, voices muffled by the thrum of traffic and music spilling from open doors. He ducked into a narrow alley to take a piss, half thinking he'd catch up in a minute. The brick walls loomed on either side, slick with grime and shadow, the air damp and strangely still. When he zipped up and turned around, he froze. The alley wasn't dark anymore. The faint orange glow of daylight spilled across the cobblestones at his feet. Cobbles, he blinked. Moments ago, the ground had been cracked tarmac littered with takeaway wrappers. Now it was uneven stone, slick with morning dew. The traffic noise was gone. Instead, the cough of an old car engine echoed from a nearby street, followed by the whistle of a paperboy. Martin stumbled out of the alley and into a world that made his stomach drop. The city was the same. Familiar corners, the same curve of road leading to the square, but stripped of everything he knew. Shiny chrome bumpers and pastel-painted cars lined the curb. Shop windows displayed tidy rows of hats, dresses, and transistor radios. Every passerby was dressed sharp, men in tailored suits and trilbies, women in patterned skirts and beehive hair. It was broad daylight. Martin rubbed his eyes, convinced he'd blacked out or taken something stronger than lager. A bus rumbled past, painted in old liveries he remembered only from history books. Its side advertised cigarettes in cheerful fonts. Nobody gave him a second glance, though his trainers and nylon jacket stuck out like a sore thumb. "Christ," he muttered, trying not to stumble. Panic gnawed at him as he wandered. He pulled out his phone, but the screen was black, dead. Not even the usual low battery warning, just a dead weight in his palm. A pub door caught his eye, the King's Arms. He knew it. At least he knew the modern version, a refurbished spot with neon lights and sticky floors. But here it stood solid and proud, with frosted glass windows and a painted sign swinging gently above. The sound of clinking glasses and laughter spilled out. Inside, smoke hung in the air. Men in flat caps nursed pints of bitter, cigarettes wedged between fingers. A jukebox in the corner played the Beatles. The smell was tobacco, spilled ale, and polish. Martin's head swam. He approached the bar, every eye following him. His trainers squeaked on the wooden floor. "You lost, son?" the barman asked, wiping a glass with a rag. His accent was rough, local. Martin hesitated. "Yeah, just trying to find my way back." The barman raised an eyebrow. "You don't look from around here." Before Martin could answer, the front door banged open. A group of young men, sharp suits and slicked hair, strode in laughing loud. One of them stopped short when he saw Martin. "What's he wearing?" he jeered, pointing at Martin's trainers. The others chuckled. Martin's heart raced. His mouth went dry. He mumbled something about needing air and turned toward the back of the pub, desperate to escape. A narrow corridor led to a door marked private. Something tugged at him. Instinct maybe, or sheer desperation. He shoved it open. Behind it lay a dim passage. His chest tightened, the smell of damp brick returned. The sound of the jukebox dulled to nothing. The corridor narrowed, shadows swallowing him, until at last he stumbled into the alleyway once again. Night had returned. Neon signs flickered across wet pavement. A taxi honked from the main road. His phone buzzed in his pocket, screen lighting up with missed calls. "Where the hell are you, mate?" one text read. Martin turned, half expecting to see cobblestones again. But the alley was as it had been, modern, cracked, littered with wrappers. The pub door he'd walked through was gone, replaced by a graffiti-splattered brick wall. His mates' voices drifted from the next street, carefree and drunk. Martin staggered toward them, his legs weak, his mouth dry. He didn't tell them what happened. He laughed it off, caught up as though nothing had changed. But as they moved to the next bar, he kept glancing back over his shoulder, searching for the pub that had no place in this time, and wondering if it was still waiting for him on the other side of the wrong door.
The bothy and the storm. The storm roared down from the high cairngorms, smothering the ridges in snow and driving the wind like a blade across the moors. The bothy appeared through the white haze like a miracle. 4 stone walls, a roof still standing, a single chimney coughing out smoke from an old hearth. 4 men reached it within the hour, each by a different path, each strangers. Colin, wiry and tense, a hill walker with restless eyes. David, broad-shouldered and blunt, a farmer's son with a stubborn gait. Fraser, young and pale, a student with books bulging in his pack. Ewan, older, gray-bearded, face weathered by years outdoors. The storm forced them inside. The bothy was small and dark, its air thick with the smoke of the fire that Ewan stoked with damp peat and half-frozen branches. None complained. The walls kept out the blizzard. They exchanged names, though little else. Strangers thrown together, waiting for weather to break. But as night grew long, a change came. Fraser began muttering, his voice low and wandering. Colin accused David of staring at him too hard. David snapped back that Colin wouldn't stop pacing the stones. Ewan tried to calm them, but his own words slurred and shook. Something heavy pressed on their thoughts. When Fraser collapsed before dawn, his skin gone pale as the snow outside, they thought at once of murder. His lips were tinged blue, his breath had stopped. David swore Colin had poisoned him. Colin shouted back that David must have struck him in his sleep. Ewan only whispered, staring into the smoke-filled rafters. The bothy shrank around them. The air felt thicker, their lungs tight. The fire spat and hissed, eating the last of the wood. By the second night, David lay dead in his blankets, chest still, face slack. Colin and Ewan accused one another, voices hoarse, eyes bloodshot. Both were sure the killer was in the room, neither dared sleep. Then Colin fell, twitching once before going still, his head thudding against the stone floor. Ewan staggered alone in the dim glow of the fire, choking on his own breath. His chest ached, his vision doubled. His knife lay loose in his hand, though he no longer remembered drawing it. He thought of the storm, of murder, of betrayal. But as the flames guttered, one thought struck colder than all the rest. The bothy had no chimney flue, only a cracked stack half clogged with soot. The smoke lingered, thick and invisible. The fire that warmed them had been slowly stealing their air. Carbon monoxide, silent, scentless, had been the true killer all along. When hill rescuers dug the bothy out days later, they found 4 men, still as statues, huddled around the dead hearth. No blood, no signs of violence, just a storm outside and a poisoned fire within. The rescuers did not linger. The smile that wasn't his Brando Budnick's face was everywhere. Billboards, banners. His crooked grin followed people around like it knew something they didn't. To the world, he was the most watched IRL streamer alive. But behind the smile, there was no Brando, only a prisoner. Every day, bodyguards woke him before dawn. His manager, Clive, dropped a phone on the table. Today's route. Keep smiling. Arguing only brought bruises or threats against his family. So he laughed into cameras, hugged screaming fans, and pretended to live a dream. Everyone believed it, everyone except 2 kids. The kids who noticed Lila, 13, and Daniel, 15, had watched Brando for years. They saw what others ignored. The stiffness when a guard touched him, the hollow look in his eyes. "He's not happy," Lila whispered. Daniel hesitated but soon agreed. When they tried telling people, they were drowned out by angry fans. Then came an invitation. Exclusive fan meetup, confidential. They thought it was a chance to help him. The backstage meet. The ballroom was buzzing. Dozens of kids screamed when Brando appeared, smiling wide under the lights. But up close, Lila and Daniel saw the truth. His eyes were glassy, his grin too tight. He whispered as he hugged them, "Don't say anything." A guard shoved him forward. The moment was gone. The trap. Afterward, a staffer led them down silent corridors. Locks clicked behind them. Clive emerged from the shadows, eyes sharp. "You saw too much," he said. "Brando's tired, you'll replace him." They laughed, thinking it a joke, until contracts lit up on tablets in their hands. In the corner, Brando slumped in chains, his smile stripped away. "Sign," Clive murmured, "or your families pay the price." The New Stars headlines exploded the next day. Brando introduces rising stars. Photos showed Lila and Daniel glowing beside him. Fans cheered the passing of the torch. Brando vanished. Nobody asked questions. For their first stream, the kids stood before the camera, Clive and the guards lurking out of frame. "Smile," Clive whispered. So they did, and the world believed it.
The haunting on the Amstel Star. Holly and James had been looking forward to their holiday for months. It had been a stressful year back in the UK, and the idea of a short getaway to Amsterdam felt like the perfect escape. When Holly stumbled across a quirky accommodation option, an old passenger ship moored along the River IJ that had been converted into a floating hotel, she couldn't resist. "It'll be fun," she said as they booked the trip. "Romantic and a bit different." James smiled, though he wasn't quite as convinced. He preferred solid ground beneath his feet, but Holly's excitement was infectious. The couple arrived in Amsterdam late in the afternoon. The canal shimmered under the setting sun. Bicycles whizzed past, and the air was filled with the mingled scents of stroopwafels, tulips, and something sweeter from the coffee shops. They dragged their suitcases down cobblestone streets until they reached the dock, where the Amstel Star waited. It was an impressive sight, a long white vessel with porthole windows and a broad deck. The sign claimed it had once ferried passengers across the North Sea before being retired and converted. Inside, the corridors smelled faintly of salt water and something older, stale wood and rust perhaps. The receptionist, a tall man with sunken eyes, greeted them with a thin smile. "You're in cabin 14, he said, sliding them a brass key. "It's quiet there." The way he hesitated on quiet made Holly glance at James, but she brushed it off. They found their room down a dimly lit hallway. The cabin was small but cozy, with a double bed, wooden paneling, and a narrow window looking out onto the darkening water. That night, they returned from dinner in the city and settled into bed. The ship creaked gently, rocking with the water. Holly was drifting towards sleep when knock, knock, knock echoed against their cabin door. She sat up. "Did you hear that?" James frowned, climbing out of bed. He opened the door to find an empty corridor stretching into shadows. No footsteps, no voices, just the faint hum of the ship's generator. "Probably some drunk guest," he muttered, shutting the door. But as soon as the lights went off, the knocking returned. Slow, deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. James opened the door again. Nothing. But the sound persisted, sometimes at the door, sometimes on the wall beside the bed, sometimes overhead as if footsteps were pacing above them. Sleep was nearly impossible. Around 3 in the morning, just as exhaustion was taking hold, Holly's eyes flew open. She had seen movement by the wall. A pale, translucent figure stepped through the wooden paneling as though it were smoke. It was a man in an old naval uniform, his face half hidden, features blurred like water-stained ink. His head tilted toward them and his mouth moved, though no sound came out. Then, just as silently as he appeared, he walked through the opposite wall and vanished. Holly clutched James's arm. "Did you see that?" James, pale and rigid, could only nod. The following day, they tried to laugh it off. "Maybe it was the wine," James suggested as they explored the canals, visited the Van Gogh Museum, and took pictures under the twinkling lights of the bridges. But neither of them was truly at ease, and by the time they returned to the ship, unease had settled in again. That night, the knocking returned, louder and more insistent. Sometimes it sounded like knuckles on the door, other times like fists pounding against metal. At one point, the bed itself seemed to tremble, vibrating with a steady rhythm. Then came the whispering. Words neither could quite catch, carried on a draft that smelled faintly of brine and decay. Holly swore she felt a cold hand brush her cheek in the dark. At 4 a.m., James snapped. He leapt from the bed, yanked the door open, and shouted into the corridor. "Stop it! Leave us alone." For a moment there was silence. Then down the hall, a shadow flickered. A man-shaped silhouette moved against the wall before melting back into it. That was enough. By sunrise, they were already packed. Holly's hands shook as she zipped her suitcase. James didn't even wait for the receptionist. He dropped the key on the desk and muttered, "We're checking out." As they stepped off the gangway and onto the solid pavement of Amsterdam, relief washed over them. The city was waking up, bicycles whirring past, bakery windows glowing warm with fresh bread. Normal life carried on, blissfully untouched by whatever lingered on the Amstel Star. They found a boutique hotel near Dam Square, with crisp sheets, bright windows, and no strange noises in the night. For the rest of the holiday, neither of them mentioned the ship. But whenever they passed the harbor, both Holly and James avoided looking too closely at the vessel moored quietly by the water, its portholes dark and watchful. And deep inside, they knew, some passengers never really leave.
The Pines remember. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. Just 4 friends from college, now in their early 30s, reclaiming a piece of the old days. They packed coolers with cheap beer, loaded gear into Tyler's SUV, and drove toward the thick woods of northern Pennsylvania. Tyler drove, as always, with too much confidence, blasting classic rock and weaving through traffic. A week earlier, he'd nearly fought during a road rage incident. A man in a beat-up pickup cut him off, and Tyler tailgated for miles shouting. The driver pulled over, glaring with a look Tyler couldn't forget, something sharp and hungry in his eyes. Tyler laughed it off. Now, hours later, the incident felt distant. They turned down gravel, then dirt, until service blinked out and the trees swallowed civilization. Night 1. They pitched tents in a clearing near a stream. Ryan was careful. Mark cracked beers before camp was ready, and Chris kept glancing at the trees, saying he heard branches snap. "Deer," Tyler said. "Or maybe Bigfoot. Relax." Near midnight, as flames died down, a low metallic clink broke the silence. Ryan looked up. "Hear that?" Mark shrugged. "Probably fire." But Chris was already up, staring into the dark. "That's not the fire." Out in the woods, wire gleamed faintly between two trees. A tripwire. The second day by morning, unease hung over them. The wire was real. Tyler kicked it down, insisting it was some hunter's snare. Chris shook his head. Snares don't point toward people. They hiked anyway, but found more signs. A buried bear trap, a tree carved with an eye, and footsteps. Always behind, never ahead. Evening brought dread. Back at camp, Tyler's SUV was scratched as if clawed. On the hood, a note pinned with a knife. "I remember you." Tyler's face drained. "It's that guy. The road rage came out. You led him here," Chris whispered. Night 2. They built the fire high. No one drank. Every snap of a twig turned heads. Past midnight, Mark swore he saw a figure in the trees watching. He blinked, and it was gone. Then the trap sprung. A log swung down, nearly crushing Ryan. A crossbow bolt whistled past Chris, sinking into a tree. Panic. They scattered. Sparks leapt as boots pounded the dirt. The chased Tyler and Ryan ran toward the stream. Behind them, Mark screamed, cut short. Chris caught up, breathless. He got Mark. "We can't go back." They stumbled into a faint lantern glow. But it wasn't safety, just a rotting shack. Inside hung trophies, clothing on walls, a burned-out family photo. From the ceiling, a note, one by one. Outside, footsteps circled. The final hours. They barricaded inside, gripping broken tools. Tyler pressed the window. "We can take him, just one guy." But when the door burst open, the firelight revealed worse. 2 masked figures entered, silent, moving as one. Chris screamed. Ryan swung, Tyler charged. The shack erupted. By dawn, the woods were quiet. Birds sang as though nothing had happened. On Tyler's SUV hood, another note rested, pinned with bloody wire. 4 down, 1 left. The last shift Ethan was 24, a junior mechanic at Branton's garage, the kind of place that smelled permanently of oil, rust, and stale cigarette smoke. He'd been working there for almost a year, and in that time he'd learned far more about cruelty than carburetors. The others, all older men with years in the trade, treated him as an easy target. They mocked his cautious way of working, tossed greasy rags at him when he bent over a hood, and sometimes even locked him in the parts cage as a joke. He laughed along at first, hoping it would fade once he proved himself. But it never did. One Friday, things got especially bad. One of the senior mechanics, Mark, pinned Ethan against the wall with his forearm and hissed, "You're never gonna make it here, kid. You don't belong in this line of work." The others roared with laughter while Ethan stood there with red cheeks, hands clenched into fists in his pockets. That night, he booked a week off, told them he was going on a short holiday. He figured some distance would cool things off. Maybe if he came back rested, things would change. The first death. The following Monday, Mark didn't show up for work. The foreman assumed he was hungover as usual. By lunchtime, though, the police had cordoned off his flat. Word spread fast. Mark had been found dead in his bed. "Heart attack, probably," muttered one of the mechanics, though unease hung in the air. Mark was only 37. Ethan, meanwhile, was miles away, staying at a cheap coastal inn. He woke to a text from a coworker. "You hear about Mark? Dead. Weird, right?" Ethan stared at the message, feeling something cold settle in his stomach. The week of deaths. On Tuesday, another man, Colin, collapsed during a job. By the time paramedics arrived, he was gone. No visible cause, no warning signs. Just a mechanic lying motionless on the greasy workshop floor, next to the car he'd been working on. Wednesday. A third man, Dave, was discovered slumped over the break room table, half-eaten sandwich in front of him. By Thursday, the garage was half empty. The surviving mechanics whispered furiously between jobs. None of them wanted to admit it out loud, but their eyes betrayed their suspicions. Ethan had been bullied by every single one of the men who were now dead, and he was conveniently away. The rumor spread from the garage to the whole town. Ethan had finally snapped. The pressure mounts Ethan had no idea how bad it looked. He tried not to check his phone, but messages kept coming. Some from co-workers, cold, accusatory, others from friends warning him that people were talking. When he returned to town on Saturday, he walked into the corner shop only to feel every eye burn into him. A woman shuffled her child away from him. The man at the counter gave him his change without a word. By evening, a police car was parked outside his flat. 2 officers came knocking. They asked polite but pointed questions about where he'd been each day of the week. Ethan felt himself stammering, his answers too clumsy, too defensive. He could see it in their faces. They didn't believe him. The truth emerges. On Monday morning, the workshop foreman arrived early. The garage felt eerie, silent, without the usual banter of the crew. He flicked on the lights and was greeted by the sharp smell of gas. At first, he thought it was just lingering fumes from a job. But when his chest tightened and his eyes watered, he realized it was something far worse. He traced the smell to the ancient boiler tucked away in a back corner, its pipes corroded, valves wheezing faintly. By noon, the fire brigade had confirmed it. A leak. Carbon monoxide seeping silently into the workshop. Every death, every collapse, it all made sense now. The irony was cruel. The men had been mocking Ethan for working too slowly, for checking gauges twice, for worrying about details. Yet it was their own carelessness, their own neglect of the very equipment that kept them alive, that had killed them. The aftermath. The news spread, but the damage to Ethan's reputation was already done. Though he was cleared officially, the whispers never fully died. People remembered too well how he'd been bullied, how he'd disappeared at just the right time. Back at the garage, Ethan returned to work in a shop that felt more like a tomb than a workplace. He avoided the boiler room, though every hiss of air, every clank of a pipe, made his pulse quicken. At night, he replayed the week in his head. How close he'd come to being destroyed by suspicion. How easily truth could be buried beneath fear. But more than anything, he thought about the faces of the men who had laughed at him, now pale and still in the morgue. And sometimes, though he'd never admit it aloud, he wondered if maybe fate had taken his side after all. The wait in the basement. When Mark bought the old farmhouse on the edge of town, he thought he'd finally found peace. The place was cheap, too cheap, and the realtor's smile a little too quick, but Mark chalked it up to luck. After years of renting, he was ready for something permanent. On his second night, while unpacking boxes, he noticed a draft in the basement. A faint hiss of cold air seemed to slip from behind the shelves. Curious, he pulled them aside and found a square of concrete that had been poorly patched. The edges crumbled easily under his hammer. Beneath was a shallow pit. Inside the hole, wrapped in rotting burlap, lay a small chest. He dragged it out with trembling hands. Inside, bricks of gold glimmered dully in the dim light, and stacks of old bills, 10s, 20s, 100s, smelled of mildew and earth. For a moment, his heart raced with joy. He was rich. That night, the house felt different. The furnace shut down 3 times. The pipes groaned like voices muttering through the walls. Mark's dreams were vivid, strangers clawing at the dirt, their mouths stuffed with coins. The next morning, his phone buzzed with bad news. His new job offer had been rescinded without explanation. Later, a neighbor's dog broke into his yard, growling, teeth bared until it collapsed, dead at his feet. The animal's glazed eyes seemed to accuse him. Mark told himself it was coincidence. But every day, something else went wrong. His bank account was hacked. His car was sideswiped in his own driveway. His sister stopped answering his calls. At night, he swore he heard footsteps pacing above him, though he lived alone. The gold weighed on him. He couldn't stop touching it, couldn't stop staring. When he tried to take it to a pawn shop, the engine of his car caught fire on the way. When he thought about throwing it back in the pit, a wave of panic gripped him so strong he nearly fainted. One stormy night, with thunder rattling the windows, Mark stood in the basement, staring at the chest. The air felt heavy, charged. Shadows clung to the corners. He whispered to himself, "It's mine, it's all mine." The basement light flickered, then died. In the darkness, something moved. Not footsteps, more like a shuffle, a drag. Mark froze. A shape rose from the pit, earth spilling from its shoulders, its eyeless face turned toward him. Coins rattled in its clenched fists. Mark screamed, but the sound never left the house. By morning, the basement was quiet. The shelves were back in place. The chest sat once more beneath cracked concrete, waiting. A week later, the farmhouse went back on the market. The realtor's smile was just as quick. The collector's house. Eddie was no stranger to breaking into homes. He'd done it a dozen times before, always quick, quiet, and clean. When he spotted the old two-story house at the edge of town, he thought it would be an easy score. The owner kept the curtains drawn, the lawn unkempt, and the mailbox overflowing. To Eddie, it screamed empty. He slipped in through the back door just after midnight. The place was strangely neat inside, dustless, orderly, every object in its place. Odd for such a neglected exterior. As he moved through the living room, he noticed a cabinet of glass jars. At first, he thought they were filled with marbles or stones. But when he leaned closer, his stomach turned. They were teeth. Hundreds of them, gleaming white under the faint light. Some still had fillings. Eddie's breath caught. That was when he heard the floorboard creak behind him. The homeowner had been there the entire time. A man in his 50s, tall, quiet, his expression unreadable. Eddie tried to bluff, to laugh it off, to say he'd made a mistake. But the man only smiled, a calm, patient smile that made Eddie's skin crawl. The last thing Eddie saw before everything went dark was the man's careful hands opening a drawer and selecting a small pair of pliers, already polished and waiting. By morning, the cabinet held one more jar, and inside, nestled among the others, was a fresh set of teeth. The circle in the green. Reese and Gareth had always laughed at ghost stories. Two lads from North Wales, stubborn and fearless, they wanted more than just a holiday. They wanted an adventure, something wild enough to brag about for the rest of their lives. So they flew across the ocean, deep into the Amazon, where guides refused to tread and maps became blank. The rainforest was a living wall of heat and noise. Insects shrieked, unseen creatures rattled branches, and the smell of damp earth clung to them like a second skin. On the first day, they hacked their way through vines and roots until their arms shook. By evening, they found a small clearing and set camp, the canopy above them weeping with mist. The next day, they pushed deeper. They walked for hours, marking trees with the edge of their machetes. Yet, as the shadows stretched long and night began to crawl over the forest, they stumbled into a clearing that looked disturbingly familiar. Their fire pit from the night before sat in the middle, cold and black. Their packs were waiting untouched. "We must have looped," Gareth muttered, though his voice shook. "Impossible," Reese said. "We've been cutting new paths all day." The second night they laughed nervously, trying to shake it off. But on the third, when the same thing happened again, laughter turned to silence. They began to notice things. The trees seemed to lean closer, their marked trunks vanishing as though the forest healed itself behind them. Birds stopped singing the moment they stepped off the clearing, as if the world were holding its breath. By the fourth night, panic gnawed at them. They shouted into the canopy, hacked at the ground, ran in opposite directions, only to crash into each other again in the same cursed spot. Their compass spun without reason. Their watches ticked, but told no time. Sleep came in jagged fragments, broken by whispers in the dark. And then came the fifth night. Their eyes were bloodshot, lips cracked, skin crawling with mosquito bites. Reese swore he saw figures moving just beyond the firelight, pale, watching. Gareth claimed he heard his mother's voice calling from the trees. Their minds frayed, and the forest tightened around them like a fist. What they did not know was that the forest wasn't cursed. Days earlier, desperate and hungry, they had plucked fruit from a tree with smooth bark and sweet-smelling apples. The manchineel, la manzanilla de la muerte, the little apple of death. To bite its fruit is to swallow fire itself. The poison twists the nerves, floods the blood, and warps the brain with fever dreams. They had never left the first clearing. Their machetes lay by their sides, rusting in the damp. Their bodies curled in the grass, foam at their mouths, eyes wide open but unseeing. The endless cycle, the looping trails, the whispers in the trees, all nothing but poison-racked visions in their final days. By dawn of the sixth morning, the rainforest had already begun to reclaim them. Vines crept over their packs. Ants swarmed their skin, birds circled overhead. The clearing was silent again, waiting for the next lost souls. The child from the sky. Eleanor and Mark had tried for years. Endless doctor visits, procedures, tears behind closed doors. Friends around them moved on with families, while their house stayed quiet. So when they drove north for a holiday in the mountains, it was supposed to be an escape. Just the two of them. No questions, no pressure. On their second night, as they hiked back from the lake, a streak of light tore across the sky. It wasn't like a shooting star. This one cracked with a sharp metallic thunder and slammed into the clearing just ahead. They ran to it, adrenaline and curiosity fighting the urge to flee. The crater smoked, and in its center was not rock but a capsule. Inside, wrapped in something like cloth but finer, smoother, was a newborn baby. Its tiny chest rose and fell. It blinked up at them. Mark's voice shook. "Ellie, it's alive." They should have called someone. The authorities, not scientists. But Eleanor was already holding the child, her arms instinctively cradling it as though it had always been hers. By the time they returned home, the decision had been made. To everyone else, they said the pregnancy had been private. A late surprise. No one questioned it, at least not openly. For a while, life was bliss. Nights filled with soft cries, mornings with sleepy smiles. But then came the incidents. At 3 months, the baby spoke, clearly, just one word, mother. At 6 months, the lights in their house flickered whenever it cried. At a year, neighbors' pets vanished. The child's dark eyes would follow the missing animal's owners without blinking. They told themselves it was stress, exhaustion, overthinking. But when they looked at the baby, it was hard not to notice the way its skin shimmered faintly under the moonlight, or how its pupils were just slightly too large. Eleanor began waking up in the night standing in the yard, staring at the stars without remembering how she got there. Mark sometimes found himself humming in a language he didn't know. And then, one evening, as they sat across from each other at dinner, Eleanor noticed Mark's hand. His fingers had lengthened. His skin had taken on that same faint shimmer. He was staring at her too, her eyes reflecting the same unnatural depth. The child watched them both, smiling as if satisfied. Eleanor tried to whisper something, maybe what's happening to us, but what came out wasn't English. Mark answered her in the same tongue. Neither of them panicked. Neither of them wanted to stop it. The baby had given them what they always wanted, a family. And by the time their friends noticed the changes, the strange way the couple's voices sometimes echoed, the way their eyes caught the light, Eleanor and Mark no longer cared. They weren't alone anymore. They were home, the passenger in the dark. The interstate at night had its own rhythm. Trucks thundered past like steel beasts, headlights cutting through the darkness in long silver beams. Among them walked Evan, a man who seemed unremarkable. Clean jacket, worn backpack, a polite smile when drivers slowed to check him out. People picked him up often. He looked safe, trustworthy. By the time they reached the next town, they always felt like they knew him. And yet, few of them were ever seen again. Evan didn't know this. Every night, he carried with him a small orange bottle of pills prescribed to help him sleep. He had been a chronic insomniac for years, the kind of man who could lie awake until dawn with his thoughts gnawing like rats in the walls. His doctor had warned him about side effects, memory gaps, strange behavior, sleepwalking. Evan brushed it off. He was desperate for rest, and rest in a way was what he got. But on nights when he swallowed the pills and set out onto the highway, something in him shifted. He wasn't aware of the darkness crawling into his mind, of the way his smile curved differently, colder, when a driver offered him a seat. He never remembered the tension that filled the car after a few miles, when his words turned probing, his voice strangely hypnotic. By morning, he'd wake up in a roadside motel or sometimes in the woods, hands dirty, shoes scuffed, backpack a little heavier than before. He told himself he must have just walked further than he thought. He never questioned why news reports seemed to follow him, why missing person posters appeared in towns just after he left. Evan was clever, frighteningly so. He read people instantly, their weaknesses, their trust, their fears. He cleaned up after himself without realizing it. The police called the phantom killer the passenger. They had no pattern, no evidence beyond the fact that victims were always last seen picking up a lone hitchhiker. Evan sometimes read those reports in diner newspapers. A hitchhiker, a clever predator still out there. He felt a chill run through him, then shook it off. What a terrifying thought, he mused. Still, late at night, he sometimes dreamed. Dreams of cold hands gripping a steering wheel, of muffled cries, of headlights vanishing down back roads. Dreams so vivid they left him sweating. But in the morning, he told himself it was just the pills, just his imagination. And so, when dusk settled again, he'd sling his backpack over his shoulder, take his medicine with a swig of water, and walk out toward the humming highway. Always waiting for the next ride. The man in the crawl space. Ethan and Claire had been living in their two-story house on the edge of town for 3 years. It was nothing extravagant. Peeling paint on the siding, a draft that whistled in winter, and a crawl space beneath the floorboards that neither of them paid much attention to. It was the kind of place people drive past without looking twice. At first, nothing seemed unusual, but little things began to nag at them. It started with forks. Claire noticed one morning that their silverware drawer was short by 2. "Did you leave them in the sink at work again?" she asked Ethan, laughing it off. He shrugged and blamed forgetfulness. Then cartons of milk seemed lighter than they should be, loaves of bread a few slices thinner. They assumed it was themselves. Busy schedules, carelessness. Maybe they were both just distracted. But then things escalated. One night, Ethan was locking up when he noticed the back door's deadbolt turned the wrong way. He could have sworn he had locked it earlier. He relocked it and tried to brush away the gnawing unease in his chest. Weeks later, Claire woke up at 3 a.m., certain she'd heard footsteps creaking through the hall. Ethan checked, baseball bat in hand, but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no one outside. But there was something else, something neither of them could explain. Claire began waking with the sensation of being watched. Her eyes would snap open, scanning the dark, but Ethan would be asleep beside her. Sometimes she thought she saw the faintest red glow, like the wink of a tiny LED, vanish before she blinked. She told herself it was just her mind playing tricks. Then came the knife. One evening, while preparing dinner, Claire reached for the butcher's block and realized the largest kitchen knife was missing. They tore apart the kitchen, searched the dishwasher, the drawers, the counters. Nothing. Ethan said maybe they'd misplaced it, but Claire's voice shook as she said, "Knives don't just disappear, Ethan." That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat in the living room in the dark, staring at the locked doors, listening. Around 2:45 a.m., he heard the faintest shift of wood from beneath the floor, the crawl space. The next day, Ethan unscrewed the grate and squeezed himself inside with a flashlight. He expected dust, cobwebs, maybe a raccoon, but what he found made his stomach turn. There was a sleeping bag pressed against the wall, wrappers from food they hadn't eaten, and the missing silverware scattered like trophies. Worst of all, there were tiny holes drilled upward through the floorboards, directly beneath their bed, the bathroom, the living room. Someone had been living there. Someone had been watching. Ethan scrambled out, heart pounding, and called Claire at work, telling her not to come home. He called the police. The officers came, but the crawl space was empty. Whoever had been living there had vanished in the hours since Ethan's discovery. They logged it as trespassing, promised patrols, but there was little else they could do. For a while, the house felt silent again, until Claire noticed a blinking light inside the smoke detector. Not the usual flash, but something off. Ethan climbed up, unscrewed it, and found not a smoke detector, but a small hidden camera wired into the ceiling. They searched the house and found 3 more, all concealed in ordinary objects, an alarm clock, a vent, even a picture frame. The police returned, took the devices, but the sense of safety never came back. Claire couldn't shake the thought, if there are cameras, then someone is watching, right now. It wasn't until a month later that Ethan stumbled across a forum on the dark web, one he should never have found. Threads of private streams traded between faceless users. And there they were, him and Claire, eating dinner, brushing their teeth, sleeping in their bed. The missing knife appeared in one clip, placed beside Claire's head as she slept, while Ethan lay unaware beside her. The comments joked, bet on when the show would finally end. That night, Claire packed a bag and refused to stay another minute. They moved into a hotel, then into a new apartment across town. The house sat vacant for months before being sold. But sometimes when Claire tries to sleep, she swears she hears a faint creak under the bed. And she knows, whether it's paranoia or memory, that somewhere, someone is still watching.